Hi everyone and welcome back to my booktube channel, Lisa in Bookland. Today I'm here to bring you my very first full book review, and that's of my favourite book, The Kingdoms by Natasha Pulley, which was published in 2021. So it's actually my birthday during the week, and over the long weekend I decided that there'd be no better way to treat myself than to reread this book, which I read for the first time last December and loved it so much, and it was so worth it. I enjoyed it just as much on a reread, which really confirmed it to me as my favourite book, because it's hard to say a book is your favourite when you've only read it once. So I suppose just some context, like when I read this book first, it was the first Natasha Pulley book I'd ever read, and it was my first encounter with her writing, so I was just like blown away. I'm going to start off this review with some like spoiler free thoughts, and then I'll move on to the more spoilery thoughts after a while, at which point I'll give a good warning and I'll put like a banner somewhere on the screen just so you don't get spoiled for this wonderful book if you haven't read it yet. Yeah, it's something so special. I'd hate for anybody not to have the same reading experience I did. This book is very difficult to give a synopsis for. Like, you really can't say any more, and I mean any more, than is in the blurb, because after about 100 pages there's just such a big change in the story and what's happening that like changes the course of the entire book, and you can't even say what that is because it's just great to just go along for the ride. The premise of this book is that it's an alternative universe where France won the Napoleonic Wars and the British Isles are now a French colony. So the very start of the book, and I very clearly remember this from my first reading experience, the first section is part 1, Londres, and chapter 1 says Londres 1898, 93 years after Trafalgar. And I remember when I read that the first time, it was just before Christmas. It was like 2 days before we were due to finish work for Christmas, and I read that much and I had to shut the book again because I was like, oh, there's no way I can start reading this book until I have time to sit down and do nothing else but read this book. And I actually put it off until we got annual leave from work. That is such an intriguing premise, obviously. So at the very start of the book, this man called Joe gets off a train in Londres at the Gare du Roi, King's Cross in French. All of the places have French names and everybody speaks French in Britain. Joe has complete amnesia. He can't remember anything before he gets off the train. He is completely lost. He doesn't understand why everybody is speaking French and what's happened. Eventually he does kind of manage to settle down a little bit in his life there, but one day he gets a postcard, and the postcard says, "Dearest Joe, come home if you remember." And this postcard has been left in the post office for him for like almost 100 years, and he's just getting it delivered now. So I mean, wow. But yeah, that's as much as I'm going to say. Anything else would be spoilers. So in terms of like my kind of spoiler free thoughts, I suppose, as I said, this is such an intriguing book. The alternate history is so well thought out, and like on a reread I like read it very carefully, and I was nearly trying to catch Natasha Pulley out in something and I couldn't manage it. Like, it's so well written, and she does say kind of in the acknowledgements at the end that it was a project of years, and you can definitely see that. There's such great characters and relationships. Oh, the plot and the plot twists were, they just kept coming at you and it just sucks you in and keeps you reading. It's funny, the dialogue is great, Natasha Pulley's kind of signature writing style is there. Yeah, it's absolutely great. I suppose just to give you some samples in a spoiler free way, the opening line really is brilliant. Like, and it kind of starts the book off with such a bang. Most people have trouble recalling their first memory because they have to stretch for it, like trying to touch their toes, but Joe didn't. This was because it was a memory formed a week after his 43rd birthday. What an opening. How could you not keep reading on after that? And there's so much more. Like, the way she describes characters is so memorable. Like, they're behind a broad desk sifting through a chaos of papers and machine parts with the determined expression of a man who insists he has a system. And I think this is my favourite one. So it's this kind of, I suppose, nervous type of character, and it's described that he skittered over to look at a person who couldn't help thinking of a discombobulated daddy long legs. There was an urge to be careful with him, but also to throw him out the window. that great? Describing kind of a tense situation, I suppose. The person that was angry and they've calmed down a bit. He's described as he had taken the flint out of his tone again, but he was still holding it. And that's such a good description, I suppose, of somebody that might go back to snap at you at any minute, or somebody that's older than their years. His smile was younger and shyer than the rest of him. It must not have been out so often. But yeah, I could go on and on, but there's kind of that usual Natasha Pulley randomness of things that just like turn up, like there's tortoises that are just ingenious. But yeah, Natasha Pulley is such a brilliant writer. This is only the second book of hers I've read. I'm lucky enough that I still have 3 more to go, including the one that's being published later this month. So now we are getting into spoiler territory, so again, please do not listen any further if you've not read this book yet. So I suppose to start off with, I'd like to talk about the overall concept of the alternate universe where France did win the Napoleonic Wars. Just that, I suppose, turning point of the Battle of Trafalgar is so intriguing, of how that turned out different. Yeah, and it really was so incredibly important, I suppose. I'm not a historian, again, I have to keep saying that, but I'm not a historian, I'm just an amateur with an interest in this period. That it did end up in most of the French and Spanish fleet being destroyed, and it did kind of stop the invasion, I suppose, of Britain, which was such a big fear before Trafalgar and kind of was never a real concern during the Napoleonic Wars after that, up to and including Waterloo. And kind of the impact of that, like I haven't read kind of any more scholarly work, I suppose, on like what would happen if France won the Napoleonic Wars, but it's something I definitely would like to in the future. And even, I suppose, myself, like the implications for Ireland, how would Ireland's history have been different. Last time the French actually did manage to land at Killala in Mayo in 1798, kind of as part of the French Revolutionary Wars as well, albeit like unsuccessfully. But yeah, it's just so fascinating, and kind of the way it impacted, like written English is illegal. There's slavery back in, like slavery was abolished in France before it was in Britain actually. But it was reintroduced in 1802 under Napoleon, so obviously they go with that theme here that it would continue into the 20th century. I did kind of read it very closely this time and try to spot any plot holes, and sometimes you'd think you would have caught her out in one, and I'd like write it down, and then a few pages later or even a few chapters later it should be explained, and it was just such a perfect book. Finally, I loved the whole concept of time and the way that was handled, and you know, how cause and effect was handled. Like, I mean, the tortoises and how they tested out and kind of established the parameters, that was fascinating. And at the end, when it's all unravelling and Joe are afraid that the 2 children are going to disappear at any minute, just like their parents have, yeah, it's just, oh wow. So that's kind of the overall concept. I suppose leading on from that, I have to say the one negative thing I have to say about this book, and that's kind of the way that Natasha Pulley treated like the Navy, the Agamemnon, which is Captain Kite's ship, and Kite is a captain in general, I suppose. So I did like know from looking at Natasha Pulley's website and that she has some sailing experience, but alas, it's on a modern sailing ship. Do you know, I can't help it when I have read so many books set in this period, fiction and non-fiction, kind of spotting the inaccuracies, but you know, I didn't let it spoil the book for me. I actually have changed them all in the book, so I've like crossed out things and crossed out paragraphs and rewritten paragraphs. It's my own copy, I can do what I want. But yeah, it's pity, I suppose, that she had got that experience in modern sailing ships when she might have done well, I suppose, to read a Patrick O'Brien or two, or visit the HMS Victory at Portsmouth or the museum there, or I suppose even looked at plans of the real Agamemnon. There's just a few things in particular, like, you know, she kept referring to the great cabin, which would be the captain's cabin, as the stateroom, which is kind of later terminology. A watch was like 6 hours, but 4 hours would be the standard. Like, chain shot is used for absolutely everything. Like, to just like chain shot wouldn't have been used against the hull, that would have been like round shot or cannonballs as we'd see them. Like, chain shot was more for like rigging. There's kind of the mention of like the smell of gunpowder everywhere, and like barrels of gunpowder left to the deck, and like, oh my god, gunpowder left on deck, they're not afraid of fire. I could go on and on. Like, you do kind of need to suspend disbelief, I suppose, a little bit with the women managing to crew the ship. Like, I'm not disparaging women in any way, but like sailing a ship of the line like that was a massively skilled job and required, it was very physical. There's mention of sailors like clipping themselves to things for safety when they went up to the yards to like bring in the sails and that. Oh, they wish. There was not those kind of safety procedures back in the early 1800s, but yeah, and the final thing I'll say about this ship is I suppose Kite runs a very unusual ship in terms of discipline and the way he teaches kind of the midshipmen and things himself, but you know, Kite is an unusual character, so I think we can let him get away with that. There was only like one thing in the end that I couldn't fix. It was like a plot point, so I had to leave that there. I suppose nobody is perfect, and most of the rest of her books, I suppose, are set in the like Victorian period, so she isn't as familiar with the Regency period or with the Napoleonic Wars. Yeah, like Natasha, if you ever want somebody to proofread your manuscript or anything, if you ever decide to return to this time period, I'd be more than happy. I won't need to pay or anything, and no official acknowledgement, just the pleasure of reading your manuscript would be more than enough for me. Moving on anyways to all the rest of the positive things I have to say for this book. So I suppose the characters, even on a reread, Kite is such an intriguing character. He's such an enigma. He's so damaged, and he does extremely questionable things. When he pushed Fred off the ship, or when he shoots that man with the tortoises in just such apparent cold blood, should we be letting him get away with it and kind of forgiving him? And when you get to that last section of the book, like, you do kind of forget those things. That's why when I returned to it in a reread, it was so jarring. Like, do you remember that time that he like whacked Joe just after he came in the ship? Like, wow. Yeah, it'll be just food for thought, like, on many rereadings, I think. And in a way, so like, it's the same with Agatha. Like, she is such a complicated character as well. She obviously has looked after Kite, but then she is quite selfish, I suppose, at times as well, and like, who can blame her, really? Like, I mean, she really has done everything the best that she can. Yeah, I suppose whether I can't decide whether I like her or not, and it's the same as kind of Natasha Pulley's other female character that I can think of. But the character I don't have any conflicted feelings about is Joe. What a pleasure to read about. I love Joe in all his incarnations. His love for his daughter, or later, his niece and nephew. The way he's written when he's starting to become closer to Kite, or feel sorry for him or understand how damaged Kite is. But at the same time is kind of always plotting in the back of his head, and how to get away or how he can take advantage of things like that, and that's very human as well. I love that most of the point of view in this book is from him, and like, oh my god, when it was revealed that Joe and Jem were the same person, I came across the note that I'd written in my first reading of this book, and it was like, I knew it, but I didn't know it at the same time, and that's so true. Like, how did I not see it? But there's just such good red herrings that really draw you away, and the same with M being Missouri Kite, like, just because he's never referred to by his first name, and it's an unusual name, and there's Madeline to distract you. With all the turmoil you've been through with the characters, like the last scene, I have never yet cried outright at a book, and very occasionally I would tear up a bit, and even on a reread of this and the second time, I had tears in my eyes in the last chapter. Just such a satisfactory ending, even if it was like, it was maybe a little bit too happy for cynical old me, but it just got to me again. What can I say? Just to mention some of my favourite moments, feel free to mention, if you've read this book, any of your favourite moments below. I'd love to be reminded. Like, when I finished this book, same as my first reading, I kind of was like flicking back and remembering all of the things we'd gone through with these characters, because so much happens. I think it's still my favourite entire moment of the book, or I suppose sequence of moments really, is when Joe is in the lighthouse and finds Kite in the water, and the night they kind of spend together in the lighthouse. Then that it's so jarring when we move to the Agamemnon and like Joe sees the other side of Kite, and that's why I think it's such a spoiler in this book to mention anything about ships, because like that is such a mind-blowing thing when you're just completely spun into this other world. I just remember being completely blown away by that when I read it for the first time. As I mentioned already, I love the scene with the tortoises when they're trying to establish the cause and effect thing between the past and the future. I love I have them written down here in front of me, but blown over by them all over again. But Madeline's letters, stop. When they're telling the French colonel about the underground, and Madeline said that she couldn't see anything wrong with it until he told her, and I felt the exact same way. Like when he mentions Waterloo and Trafalgar, you're like, oh my god. Just like, when you're just so used to place names, you stop attaching any meaning to them, and you just felt so sorry for her at that point, because it's obvious when you see it in retrospect, but how could she have thought of it beforehand? And that was just like, you really got this feeling in your chest of things going so completely wrong. But I suppose more lighthearted then. I love after they break the blockade at Edinburgh, and Joe kind of commandeers a carriage from this wealthy gentleman, and they get in, and I suppose calm of the inn after all of the bloodshed in the battle. Jem and Kite reuniting before Trafalgar, obviously. Great reunion. Different altogether, but Clay and Kite and the tiger. And like Kite is so used to the tiger, he doesn't think there's anything unusual, and Clay is like, oh god, I have to do exactly what I'm told. There's a big tiger here. Kite is completely unhinged. But yeah, as I said, the ending maybe like a bit too sweet for me, but at the same time it does manage to get me every time. Maybe I'm a hypocrite to say it any different. But finally, I suppose I just wanted to give some thoughts on rereading, because this was my second read, and I stand by what I said in a previous video about rereading, that I think this is such a rereadable book. So as I said, it stood up to close scrutiny. I knew what was going to happen in advance, but still I couldn't find any plot holes, and it was a detailed enough plot that I'd forgotten lots of the small details as well, which was good. And because I was kind of a little bit less blown away by the plot, I kind of had more room to take in everything else that was going on and kind of think things through properly, which is nice. So I suppose a real reflection for it on me was like, because I've now read The Watchmaker of Filigree Street as well, and kind of I'm familiar with I suppose, I don't really want to call them tropes, but the kind of things that Natasha Pulley writes about, the relationships she writes about, the kind of characters that kind of maybe share similar kinds of characteristics. I love the characters' relationships in this, don't get me wrong, but I would say the highlight of this book definitely is the setting and the plot and the premise of kind of the time travel and that. I suppose if somebody was to write a book for me, if they were to sit down and ask me what I'd like a book about, I wouldn't have been able to think of this, but it really is the perfect book for me, and that's why I love it so much. I've only read one other alternative history Napoleonic Wars book, and it was absolutely awful. So if anybody knows of any other ones out there, please let me know. I have actually read another one as well. It's different, as in the premise isn't that France won the Napoleonic Wars, it's about the Napoleonic Wars itself, but there are dragons, so obviously that's a different story. It's the Temeraire series by Naomi Novik. I've read the first 3 books of that. But anyways, as I said, the premise of this is just supreme. Finally, I suppose one thing I did find intriguing that I didn't spot the first time, or I spotted it, but there was so much else going on, I didn't have time to think about it. And they do say after under the 2 pillars, when Joe looks down into the water, he can see the city, and there's a visible spire underneath the water. And then when they're bricking up the gap between the pillars and building the tower around it to stop people travelling through time, they mention that it's being built on kind of like an artificial island. So yeah, wouldn't it be fascinating if that came up again in another book? Like maybe there's be some implications for that being blocked off. In my wishful thinking that Natasha Pulley would stick with like nautical themes, I was like, oh, what about if it stops sea monsters returning home or something, just to force Natasha Pulley into writing more books set on ships. But yeah, that is most of my thoughts about the kingdoms, at least without boring everybody by like reading out half of the book, because I loved her writing so much. How lucky am I that I still have 3 Natasha Pulley books to read. I'm going to read The Lost Future of Pepper Harrow later this month for a read along, and I have pre-ordered The Half-Life of Valerie Kay that's coming out later in the month as well, so I imagine I'll read that straight away as well, and then I'll just have the Bedlam Stacks, which I'll probably read in August, because Jane Austen July is in July. But yeah, so 10 out of 10 after my corrections. Brilliant book. I love the Kingdoms. Highly recommend it. I hope you liked this single book review, even if it was probably a little bit gushy, but yeah, what can you expect when you're talking about your favourite book? Thanks for listening, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next Thursday for my next video.